Welcome everybody to the third session of Entanglements, the last one for this semester, which brings together an invited speaker. In this case, we have two invited speakers on a collaborative project that are entangled with a faculty member at the Cooper Union. And in this case, we have our esteemed colleagues from Australia, Naomi Stead and Hélène Frichot, which I'm going to introduce to you in more detail in a little bit, and our beloved colleague, Michael Young, who's an assistant professor at the Cooper Union. And we're going to talk today about experimental forms of writing in architecture, and specifically the genre of Ficto-Criticism, which is a mode of writing that, as Naomi and Hélène discuss, fuses the genres of essay, critique, and storytelling. Specifically, they will present their newly published book by Bloomsbury, was just published in November, Writing Architecture's Ficto-Critical Approaches. They argue that Ficto-criticism is a creative architectural practice, a new type of disciplinary object, which crosses different epistemological territories of knowing and seeing. And they ask the question in the brief of the talk, what happens when fiction, experimental writing, and criticism are combined and applied to architectural projects and problems, challenging assumptions about contemporary social and political realities and the boundaries of the discipline itself. Architects and fiction writers, as our invited speakers argue, share the same ambition to imagine new worlds into being. Design is common to them both as a transformed project of reality, ever so slightly skewed from reality, so as to allow the audience's suspension of disbelief. So from my understanding of the book, having gone through it, Ficto-Criticism is not about the construction of metaphors, allegories, symbolisms, or fantasies, but about a type of painstaking precision, detail, specificity extruded from reality, endowing belief and plausibility in the projection of future worlds in either words, drawings, or images. Overall, the book is a very important collection of writings where existential ideas about world orders migrate through different architectural and spatial typologies. It allows the readers to travel between different times, places, and objects of investigation, enabling affinities based on the extrusion of evidence to an event lingering between reality and fiction. And with that, I would like to introduce our two invited speakers. First, Naomi Stead, who is an architectural academic, scholar, and critic based in Melbourne, Australia. Her research focuses on architecture's cultures of reproduction, mediation, and reception, visual sociology in architecture, gender equity in architectural practice, feminist architectural theory, and last but not least, experimental writing in architecture, which is the main subject of today's gathering. Naomi Stead is a professor and the head of the Department of Architecture at Monash University and the former president of the Society of Architectural Historians of Australia and New Zealand. She was also the leader of the Australian Research Council and led the project Equity and Diversity. Her most recent edited book before the one that we're currently focusing on today was Speaking of Buildings, Oral History in Architectural Research, published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2019, and has been shortlisted for the Colvin Prize by the Society of Architectural Historians in the UK. Hélène Frichot is a professor of architecture and philosophy and the director of the Bachelor of Design at the University of Melbourne in Australia. She's also a guest professor and the former director of critical studies in architecture at the School of Architecture at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden, where she was based between 2012 and 2019. Drawing on the two disciplines in which she's trained, architecture and philosophy, her research engages a transdisciplinary field by experimenting with feminist theories and practices, specifically drawing on new materialism and the post-humanities. She's the author of Creative Ecologies, Theorizing the Practice of Architecture by Bloomsbury in 2018, How to Make Yourself a Feminist Design Power Tool, published by AADR in 2016, Dirty Theory, Troubling Architecture in 2019, and co-editor with Naomi Stead of the book Ficto-Critical Approaches, Writing Architectures. And they're going to be joined by Michael Young, who wrote a piece in this book, The Aesthetic Recycling of Cultural Refuse. Michael is the founder and principal of Young and Ayala and an assistant professor at the Cooper Union. And I'm going to describe him a little bit like Buckminster Fuller used to describe himself. He was born a ficto-criticist in many ways. He's an architect, a designer, archaeologist of the future, musician, and director of Future Pasts. So with that, I would like to welcome Naomi and Hélène. Thank you so much for joining us, and they will be followed by a short presentation by Michael, and then we will have a Q&A. So please write your questions in the chat, and we will address them in the order they were received. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. So the way Naomi and I want to proceed today is that I'm going to commence by sort of opening up what the project was about, where it comes from, and where we see a future sort of momentum for a methodology such as ficto-criticism. And then Naomi is going to bring us back through the contents more closely and perhaps even offer some readings. So I'll just launch in. First, of course, Naomi and I need to offer certain acknowledgements. So, for instance, much of the work that I undertook on this collection was supported by a Swedish Riksbanken's Jubileumsfond sabbatical award throughout 2017, when I was still directing critical studies in architecture at KTH Stockholm. And the original material that many of the authors developed was first sort of performed or read at a symposium that Naomi and I co-convened with the support of ACH, Architecture Theory, Criticism, History at the School of Architecture at the University of Queensland during a fellowship that I had there from June to August 2016. So a shout out to ACH too, who supported this first kind of workshop symposium. And this is also where Naomi had been based before taking up her current role of head of school at architecture at Monash. Now, the book, just to kind of, sketch out its structure, it has 17 contributors, or 17 chapters, that is, including our introduction. And Naomi's going to speak more directly to some of the work of contributors. And of course, we're going to hear from Michael. Now, we open the book with a prelude by Jane Rendell at the Bartlett, very well known for her site writing and critical feminist spatial practices. As such, we sort of launch in, we start from the midst of a questioning of architecture, what architecture is, what it can do, what it means to think of it in an adjectival form, architectural, or as a solid noun, architecture. And how, by playing with writing as a mode of experimentation, by writing with or as architecture, we can also begin to reveal certain power relations within our discipline. Now, as a postlude to close the book, we invited Stephen Newkey, an Australian ethnographer trained in linguistics and semiotics, whose PhD studied the storytelling approaches of Australian Aboriginals around Broome, Western Australia, and who today spearheads a post-humanities hub at Flinders University, South Australia. So we closed the book by opening up a transdisciplinary space, though of course across the book we've included contributors from a number of disciplines. But in kind of, closing with Stephen Newkey, it's also important to here today commence down under, where Naomi and I both are in Melbourne, Australia. And as the editors of writing Architecture's Ficto-Critical Approaches, this is also where we both, as younger scholars, first encountered the practice of ficto-criticism because of our, I would say, transdisciplinary curiosity in other kinds of methodologies. But this also means we need to acknowledge our location. We have to pause here to acknowledge that we live and work on the unceded lands of the traditional owners, the first custodians, Australian Aboriginals. For me, this means the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation, who have managed country and the stories that go with it for millennia. Now back to Stephen Newkey and his postlude. He also helps us to conclude the collection because, well, he's one of the first authors in the Australian context, deeply engaged in post-colonial theories and issues, who is associated with ficto-criticism. He's one of the kind of signatures on this concept and methodology, as is Anna Gibbs, whose work we include in this volume too. They are both Australians, as are we, the editors, and in the post-colonial context of Australia, like all of us, we're still struggling with the enduring violence of its colonial settler legacy, recognising the importance of telling different kinds of stories, listening to diverse voices, enunciating their concerns from different positions, which seems crucial and also very challenging, and we're apt to kind of get it wrong as well. Now, interestingly, in terms of this thing called ficto-criticism, this methodology, this object of study, Australia and Canada, both Commonwealth countries, both still unbelievably beholden to a British Crown as head of state, have sought out specifically ficto-critical means in search of stories to make their own. So ficto-criticism emerges both in the Australian and the Canadian contexts, in terms of its kind of historical emergence, we could say. And I'll speak more to that shortly. What was also really amusing for me when I first arrived in Sweden to take up my position in 2012 at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology, was that there, amidst a kind of active group of sort of feminist theorists and practitioners, I discovered experiments that they were describing as critical fictions. So we have this kind of ficto-criticism on the underside of the world, these critical fictions on the kind of upper northern reaches of the planet. Curiously though, at least down under, ficto-criticism, with or without the conjoining punctuation that is the hyphen, commences as a means of locally engaging the influence of French theory from the 1980s and into the 1990s. It renders vivid some of the reception history of this moment in the Australian context. And yes, this is during theory's heyday. What results is a willingness, though, through this reception history, to undertake experimentation in the essay form, to let loose formations of subjectivity, to engage decolonising adventures, to swerve our points of view on environment worlds. When we take up the concept and method that is ficto-criticism, it's important for Naomi and me, if I can speak for both of us, to situate ourselves, to situate our knowledges, and here I nod to Donna Haraway, in the midst of what is happening to us when we first encounter ficto-criticism as young scholars, infected by the promise of what experimental approaches to writing might enable us in our own journeys into architecture as younger people. Specifically, could writing be another way of practicing architecture? Could it be a medium through which architecture might be adequately expressed? In our introduction, we asked what happens when fiction and criticism are combined and then applied to architectural projects and problems, sites and situations, histories and theories. But beyond this, what about when ficto-criticism becomes the means of expressing architectural work, bringing something previously unimagined into existence? Insofar as architecture is assumed to be constructive, we would argue, so too are explorative approaches to writing. This is something we would insist upon as writing practitioners. Here, writing architectures in the plural, which is the title of this collection, is understood to bring things, constructions, spaces, material relations into existence, even if only fleetingly, even if only as long as it takes for the line of prose to be read. The essay becomes a test site, essayer in the French, to test something out, to explore something, where attempts are made where we fail as well as succeed. And this is important because writing here is not being used to offer a report that is written after the fact of something that has taken place. It is an experiment in its own right. Much like the conceptual forays undertaken in the early stages of a design esquisse, writing, we argue, can be an act of creative invention. So less than a methodology applied than a methodology formed in the act, happened upon, an experiment, entangled with an experience, matter and meaning, theory and practice, in relay. There is no need to go over the old ground of the battles that continue to be fought concerning the enduring importance of theory for architecture as for other disciplines, except to say that ficto-criticism offers a place where theory becomes exactly this act of experimentation, ideally directed at the kinds of problems that are troubling us in and beyond architecture. This too is where we see the enduring relevance of an approach such as ficto-criticism in the emergence of, for instance, such formations as the environmental humanities and how this is being increasingly picked up in architectural discourse and research. And for me too, where the environmental humanities intersects with the post-humanities, understood as that domain which demands that we rethink the presumed exceptionalism of the human subject, which is a fiction of a special kind. Now, here Naomi might further speak to the role that cultural studies takes up in its relation to architectural studies too. Just venturing a little bit further into this domain of the environmental humanities though, which I think is an interesting place where ficto-criticism is already moving, we can think, for instance, of the Routledge Companion to the Environmental Humanities, edited by Ursula Heiss, John Christensen and Michelle Neiman, where the role of telling stories is stressed, including how to construct the most environmentally adequate story templates. The editors of this Routledge Companion to the Environmental Humanities go so far as to suggest that experimental techniques of a 20th century avant-garde, collage, montage, self-reference, combinations of text and image, can take on new environmental functions for the environmental humanities. At the same time, there is the challenge of how to combine thick description with something like statistics, for instance. How, after all, can we collectively offer an adequate account of what we are confronting amidst this so-called Anthropocene? We need to draw on both the sciences and humanities for this work. Now, just another point of reference, and here I guess what I'm trying to argue for is the ongoing relevance of ficto-criticism and how there's evidence of it being picked up in the environmental humanities and much of the work that's going on there, as well as the post-humanities. And just another example of this, perhaps even more adventurous, you might be aware of the really inspiring work of Anna Singh and her co-researchers. For instance, Singh's Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins, where she follows the story of the Matsutake mushroom. And also her collaborative editing of Arts of Living on a Dying Planet, with its ghosts and its monsters populating the essays that again move between sciences and humanities. And then even more recently, the truly wonderful Feral Atlas. I'd really recommend checking this out, which is an online platform supported by Stanford University, which, and I quote Anna and her collaborators, invites you to explore the ecological worlds created when non-human entities become tangled up with human infrastructure projects. This adventure in storytelling on this platform, Feral Atlas, seems particularly appropriate to the theme of this series dedicated to entanglements, a term that has infected discourse concerned with our human, more than human environmental relations, a semiotic material concept that must surely be tracked back to Donna Haraway's early work and her more recent work, as well as the work of Karen Barad in Meeting the Universe Halfway, and now with Anna Singh, who has recently joined the University of Santa Cruz. Now, just going a bit further into the feral atlas, which I'm totally fascinated in at the moment, because I just see the possibilities for how this kind of practice and performance of ficto-criticism is very much alive there. And just to further my case, as it turns out, in the feral atlas, which features a number of field reports, there is one from among many others by Leslie Stern, a self-identified ficto-critic. One who, in her practice, mixes genres, writes according to constraints and in collaboration, for instance, with Lauren Berlant in The Hundreds. She indecently deploys memoir, allows in some subjective detail. She mashes together cultural studies with environmentalism. And as her own CV states, she is known for her ficto-critical writings. In her field report, she tells the story of the destructiveness of rats and humans for the feral atlas. And interesting for us as, as Australians at the ends of the earth, Leslie Stearns has also passed some of her career down under. Now, we stress this only to draw attention to something of a delicate skein of relations and connections that hook together those hooked on a particular experimental approach to writing with worlds in the making. And this also includes some recent work Naomi and I have undertaken with a group of scholars, including Katrina Gabrielsson, on an idea of transversal writing, which is perhaps a story for another day. You can check out Writing Places, edited by Klaske Havik, a journal out of TU Delft. But finally, before I hand over to Naomi, ficto-criticism, we humbly suggest, helps us find the way while we are on the way. Where fiction sets out to construct worlds, and we have to be wary of the worlds we construct and the environments we alter on the way, because there are dangers and risks, as well as happy encounters and joys. This is our truly affective encounter. Criticism, on the other hand, so we have fiction and criticism, ficto-criticism. Criticism is assumed at best to be emancipatory, but here it is important to understand that the critic herself holds no privileged position. She is mired in the thick of the situation she is currently embroiled in, undertaking, as a matter of necessity, what Isabelle Stengers would call imminent critique. So here we are. And now what I want to do is hand over to Naomi, who's going to lead you through some of these ficto-critical constructions that we've collected together. And this is the point at which I just want to make a big call out to our wonderful collaborators, with whom it was really a joy, I think, for us to work. So Naomi, I'm going to just pass over to you now.
Very well. Thank you very much, Hélène. And yes, let me begin by agreeing that this book has been such a pleasure. As we all know, not all books are a pleasure. Some books are a rather intense labor. But this one was a pleasure. The publisher was a real pleasure to work with. The publisher, of course, being Bloomsbury, and all of the contributors, so willing, so engaged, so generous, and so interesting. So what I'm going to talk through is the kind of fascinating and not entirely anticipated process of how the book ended up being structured, which, as you can imagine, was not as we had initially imagined. So Hélène and I, as all book editors, had a schema in mind for the sections of the book, the kinds of areas that it might address. And of course, none of that came to pass whatsoever, because the essays which we ultimately received had wandered off the track. And I mean that in the best possible way. Now, I have made you a hokey diagram to illustrate this. So I'm going to show it. I'm going to share my screen. So here we have this is the contents of the book. It is, as Hélène mentioned, it's a book of 19 chapters, of which the prelude, the postlude, and the introduction are 3. And as I mentioned, we had a kind of meta structure of 3 sections, which did not end up coming to pass. So what I'm going to talk through a little bit briefly here is some of the thematics that emerge, and the way that in which we put the order together in a much more impressionist and much less constructivist way than initially planned. So as Hélène has mentioned, there was the prelude and introduction, which I won't dwell upon. I can't actually see that. Let's see. the ongoing legacies of colonial violence, which are a very big deal in Australia and obviously many colonial countries, is a really powerful theme in the book. And I would say in one way or another, it runs through many of the chapters, but it's particularly clear in these opening 3 chapters by Anna Gibbs, Katrina Schlunker, and Hélène Frichot, and where we start to see writing as itself a practice of decolonization and a spatial practice of decolonization. There's also a thematic around islands and histories of oppression which have particularly occurred in island states, and which is really gathered quite beautifully, I would say, in Helene's own chapter. But also the chapter by Elke Krasny and Phoebe Giannisi, where they're looking at a prison island, Treachery Island, and what would the stones say if the stones could speak. There's a strong theme here, once again, running throughout, but particularly captured in these 3 chapters around field trips, field notes, ideas of evidence, the way in which evidence is used by both critics and writers of fiction, and the practice and action of witness and how important that is. So, and how all of these things are gathered together in the writing that we do in and for research, in and of research. As you can see, there's overlaps. So, for example, Elke and Phoebe's paper is both islandish and field trippish. We also see quite a strong thematic of writing and walking. So I'm sure many of you have noticed that there's an absolute resurgence of interest in walking as a critical aesthetic practice, which I must say is one of my own interests as well. But this link between writing and walking is a strong thematic in the book, and particularly walking in the city, and particularly the specific subjectivity of women walking in the city and in the footsteps of other previous women writers. Michael's chapter, which we will hear about shortly, is in this section, which I've called roughly provocations about possible alternate aesthetic regimes. And they're corkers, both of these essays. Oh, I should say corker is Australian slang meaning excellent essay. Scott Coleman and Lars Leroup's chapter is an absolute romp, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Michael has to say about his. There's a really nice series of 4 chapters, which I think we could call genre pieces. And I'm going to give you a little short reading from one of these in a minute, Andrew Steen's Niece House, Woodland Lakes, which is a kind of play, somewhat parodic, somewhat loving play on the hard-boiled detective genre. The Banister, which is by Katrina Simon, is a play on the ghost story. Very architectural, specifically architectural twist on the ghost story. And the other 2, I think we could say, were plays on literary fiction, where Sandra Caggiagrady's paper is a, let's say, parodic rewriting of Jeffrey Eugenides' The Marriage Plot, which she rewrites as The Marriage Rot. Very amusingly. And then last but not least, and I see that Sepide is here with us. It's really wonderful that you could join us, Sepide. A sort of indefinable, very beautiful work of what she describes as dissident fiction by Sepide Karami about waiting. Then, of course, as Hélène has mentioned, we have The Postlude by Stephen Mukey. So as you can see, this is a pretty heterogeneous series of thematics and moments that emerge from the chapters in the book, rendered here as a rainbow. And I just want to make a short reading from 3 of them. So Anna Gibbs, who is a kind of giant in the field of Australian ficto-critical writing and cultural studies. This one, forgive me, this is my own essay, but it's not my own bit in it. It's Katrina Schlunker that I will be reading from, and Andrew Steen's Niece House, Woodland Lakes. So I'm going to go into that, and the thing that I'm going to kind of leave you to meditate on while I'm reading is the illustration from Anna Gibbs's chapter. There's not many illustrations in the book, I must say, but this is one which is very moving, and I just draw your attention not only to the text, which is drawn from a history of Australian history, which of course is a kind of colonized colonial history, and what it obscures, which is a kind of pastoral image of Tasmania. So let's begin with Anna Gibbs. Anna writes, once upon a time, critique could rely on the capacity of expertise for distinction. especially between subjects and objects, to construct a framework of authority supporting its arguments. Once upon a time, Ficto-criticism challenged the pretensions of writing in the humanities to unsituated and passionless objectivity, insisting on the key role played by the affective investments of story, curiosity and excitement as indices of what mattered in humanities research. In fact, the ficto and the critical always ran in both directions, stealing from each other's houses. For example, philosophy, if we can take it as an instance of the critical, borrowed ways of figuring from fiction, as Michel Lederf has shown. And fiction took on argument by other means in the novel of ideas, even as its mark of distinction, according to Bakhtin, was its all-inclusiveness, its ability to cannibalize other genres, especially extra-literary discourses, so that it became an encyclopedia of other knowledges, as Barthes has it. More recently, a form of experimental writing has come into being whose appropriations of theoretical vocabulary rendered them sensuous, creating a third language. Anna continues, I became an experimental writer a long time ago because I couldn't tell a story to save myself. I had too much uncertainty about story as psychic container, too much hesitation about narrative point, and even more doubt about where I could make a story go. As much doubt as Derrida had about the arrival of letters at their intended destinations in the days we still used the postal service. Besides, I was a feminist and I understood the logic of the suffragettes who went about blowing up the mailboxes, even if I only wanted to do it in theory which did seem, way back when, to be a series of love letters between men. That's Anna Gibbs. Now I am going to read you a short excerpt from Katrina Schlunker's essay, and you'll see here that the spectrum, fiction and criticism, is of course a spectrum, is in no way a binary, and that the different essays in the collection situate themselves along this spectrum in fascinating ways. So I think the thing that I love about this piece by Katrina Schlunker is the place of memoir, observation, setting, and let's say character. Katrina Schlunker writes, the logics of the escalator have to be learnt. As a small child, I came from the country to Sydney with my family for the first time that I remember. We were children used to finding our way across paddocks, responsible in our negotiations of creeks and swamps, sensible of danger, and we knew to plan our routes of return. Perhaps because of this and the certain boundaries of the department store, my parents let us roam free in David Jones, an Australian department store. I found the escalator and classified it in the minor order of sideshow alley rides that I knew from the country shows. To step on the ride was certain and thrilling. I didn't know at first that I could move on them, tripling the power of every step I took into the air, but I learnt. And I kept arriving higher and higher, following my fellow travellers around the top to the next one and the next one, higher and higher, until there was nowhere else to go. Then I was lost. How did I go down? And then I saw that they also went down, but by walking around a longer loop. It was a knitted sequence, up, up, drop one, round, return, down, down. Going down felt wrong, against the order of nature. I felt about to topple, girded myself against bumping, against the overheady sensation of descent. But at bottom, I was not where I started. The escalators divided particular layers, but I had no idea with which layer I had begun. I began the grim return, up, 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 with short, increasingly panicked excursions out from the top of each stair. Every time having to return again and again to these always moving steps. I began to think I'd missed something somewhere. I'd been glided away from my bearings. I knew I'd been gone longer than I should have. Then I saw the miracle of my father, simply standing with a bit of a smile on his face, and I surprised him by crying into his thick wool sports jacket and pure wool woven tie that everyone who grew wool wore then. We were starting to get worried, was all he said softly, smiling as if, of course, children always returned from exploring a city shop, from riding the escalators in tears, overwrought, and thankful for a moment for a father from the country. Quite a beautiful meditation on the escalator and on the technologies that we in architecture take for granted. Now, the last of my excerpts I'm going to read is from Andrew Steen, the chapter I mentioned called Nice House, Woodland Lakes. Andrew writes, and so I would say there's a kind of suburban Gothic going on here, which is very familiar to Australian audiences, and I suspect also those elsewhere. He writes, the house was one of a type. There were 6 types. Each had been given the name of a city of which it was supposed to be reminiscent. None of the houses was remarkable. All were of similar construction type and material, which could be defined as cheap. Of course, home buyers didn't see cheapness in the construction or materials. They saw largeness of rooms and number of bathrooms. Home buyers also saw cheapness in price, and they liked what they saw. This house was a Nice. The developers of Woodland Lakes had worried about the name in regards to potential mispronunciation. They decided to go with it, agreeing that if people said the wrong name, they would still be saying a positive word, and someone might correct them. That would make a pleasant talking point. The Nice was a 3-bedroom type with 2 bathrooms, an ensuite, kitchen with European appliances, open plan living with floating timber floors, ducted air conditioning throughout, cut pile wood carpeted bedrooms, and a double garage. It was painted sand. Sand was the standard colour of the Nice. The developers didn't think that the name of the colour was incongruous with Nice. No one proposed pebble. To paint any house in Woodland Lakes a different colour, the homeowner or homeowners needed to get special dispensation from the local estate authority. The authority had a thick printed covenant that spelled out what was allowed and what was not. I see that I'm unstable, hopefully. Incredibly deadpan, and Andrew's particular shtick is deadpan, hard-boiled, flat affect literature. So it's, I think, a particularly interesting take on that in relation to suburbia. So let me just stop sharing now. And in closing, say that the thematics of the book turned out to be quite kaleidoscopic, I think. Maybe Hélène would agree with me that there are some themes which run throughout, which are particularly around cities and urban experience, walking, as I mentioned, feminist approaches to experimental writing, as Hélène mentioned, and particularly subjectivity, questions of embodiment and situatedness, sometimes to the point of a radical kind of specificity of the type we don't usually see in architectural discourse, and in particular in architectural criticism. We see themes around the legacies and reparations of colonial history, practices of decolonization, and the voices and perspectives of dispossessed, marginalized, and oppressed peoples. There's a particular take on parody and the parodic, and also on speculation and the hypothetical. And it's on that point that I think it's a nice link with Michael.
Okay, so I'll jump in. First of all, I want to say thank you to Lydia for hosting, and then also a huge thank you to Helene and Naomi for including me in the project. I'm so excited to be part of it and looking forward to reading all of the other essays. So I'm going to share my screen. Are we seeing a single image? Yeah. Okay, so this is what I'm going to talk about. About a year and 4 days ago, this Instagram post was sent to us by Moore Segal. Moore Segal was a former employee of my practice, Young and Ayada, that I have with Kutan Ayada here in Brooklyn. And it's a post from a group called Dada Daily. And the reason that Moore sent me this was not because of what Dada Daily was selling. Dada Daily was selling this candle, which if you light the fingers, of course, there's one finger that you cannot light. Is what their merchandise is. It's what they're selling as a product. The reason that Moore sent this to me was because of this image, specifically this still life that Dada Daily had jacked their product into, a kind of montage into a reality to posit it as something that would begin to become familiar, but of course familiar now within associated collection of objects, which is the 17th century Dutch still life, which could never have possibly ever been a real table that anybody got up and left, but instead kind of builds a world out of its sort of combinations and conflicts. Now, the reason Moore sent that to me was because about a decade ago, we were experimenting with technologies that we use every day as architects. This is Rhino. And the reason we were experimenting with it is we wanted to understand what was going on behind the scenes, and decided that actually the geometry that was operating within digital software was much more akin to painting in its aesthetic effects than it was to drawing. And so we started to produce these kinds of speculations on depth perception, resolution, vibratory effects, and decided that this was leading us to a form of ornament or decoration, which we then applied to a series of 3D printed objects. And these 3D printed objects, these vases, we wanted to make sure that the full color 3D print, along with its ornament and its decoration, would allow the object to not be registered as a fake powder thing, but a real thing made of real stuff. Maybe you can't quite tell what that stuff is, but could you, through these articulations, begin to create a kind of reality through an altered kind of materiality? To test this idea, to see if this was really cooking into somewhere interesting, we decided to jack it into Dutch still lifes. And so here was the first one, and then we did another one, and then we did another one, and then of course we did this one. Now, this is our image. It's our image after Peter Gleis. We've just extended it by a few hundred years. Dutch still life, by the way, is a montage of various objects painted by the painter to interact with each other at various points in time. Again, it was never ever a table that actually had these things there in the world. It's a constructed realism. And this is what Dada Daily took when they put their candle in it. So I emailed them, or I chatted with them on Instagram, and I said, hey, thanks for using our still life. Can I use it in my lectures? It makes the point even better than we can. How, which one? Yeah, so they didn't even know. And you could tell that they didn't know because they didn't realize that they had actually appropriated our thing that we had appropriated and jacked their thing into our thing that we had jacked in previously. So the montage of the reality of an image into the reality of another image is part and parcel of what Dada was about, and what Dada in this case was trying to sell, and what we were speculating on in the first case. That we're ever more deeply in a world in which the questions of the image of reality and reality as constructed through images is our background that we operate as architects. So this is tied to a larger project I've been working on for a number of years called Reality Modeled After Images. And of course, the next step to do, and you probably expect it already, is to look at the École des Beaux-Arts. So the reason to look at the École des Beaux-Arts is not because I'm going to ground this within historical legitimacy or find the lineage that is necessarily meaningful for contemporary work, but to say that the École des Beaux-Arts had a theory and a system and a paradigm of image making through rendering. And it revolves around three interrelated terms: poché, entourage, mosaic. Poché, we know as architects, the cut of the plan or the section through the solidity of the masonry or the solidity of the wall. Entourage, all the objects, the landscape, the vegetation, the water, the clouds, everything that is outside of the architecture, everything that is not architecture. And the mosaic, which is the surface effects, the rendering of depth, the rendering of pattern, ornament, articulation of the surface, really about, in many ways, controlling and guiding and manipulating attention through images. And just another example from the École des Beaux-Arts here, the entourage floating outside with the clouds and the landscape, the mosaic hovering within as the surface rendering in the poché, as the abstraction rendered out for the space between these two, that which hides in the shadows. So the research has been focused on how these three terms are still operative today. Here are three researchers and architects and academics in Sweden, and Hélène probably knows them, especially Ulrika Karlsson. And this is their study of the interiors of a number of apartments within Stockholm using LiDAR and photogrammetry, where the poché becomes all which is removed from the access of the information scan, meaning all the points that are hidden within the energetic reflections that cannot be stored by the technology. The question of mosaic is deeply embedded in our world of manipulating attention, the attention economy of convolutional neural networks, which is how image searches are being structured and how we are being monitored to be turned into, rendered as data for corporations to monetize. And here's a way in which that begins to become an aesthetic effect in and of itself as a neural network produces the reality of Notre Dame de la Tourette, a form of La Tourette with the style articulation of Notre Dame. And then entourage is, of course, still operative today in terms of the ways in which we speculate, the ways in which we make renderings through the collected reuse of images as objects sampled and extracted from popular culture, sampled and extracted primarily from the internet. And so, and one last point to this, in this world that we are currently in with scanning, the difference between the three is being compressed, often blurred, because poche is literally a data shadow. Entourage is just as real as the objects behind it. And all of this is a surface mosaic of a very thin, glitchy body registered as points floating in space. So entourage is what I'm going to talk about, because entourage was the thrust of what led me into the piece that I wrote for the Ficto-Criticism book. So first of all, entourage, we often think of as these scale figures that drop into a rendering. And this one is kind of amazing because it's the American Dream shopping complex. And we should initially and readily just critique the hell out of it for what it represents and its falsity. But the reason that it is put in there is to provide a sense of familiarity, a scenario, a sense of scale, a sense of activity and program, and to direct the image, the architectural image, to an audience. Now, entourage, as far as when it begins within architectural renderings, is in doubt, but at one level it begins with painting. But of course, painting architecture was used as the background to structure an organization within a genre, to present different formal articulations, highlight gestures, because everything was ultimately about the narrative played out by the figures in the foreground. When those figures become part of architecture, and partly to sell architecture to an audience that was now traveling through the Grand Tour, those figures, which provided, again, the familiarity, the scenario, and directed audience, began to be used in a different manner. Here, the figures are no longer the conceptual foreground, they're the conceptual background, directing attention to aspects of the architecture. But architects would hold them in a kind of ontological difference, where entourage in buildings shall not be confused as being of the same order of reality. And this continues to this day, where entourage is either shadowed or cut out and the building is rendered realistically, or the building is rendered abstractly and the entourage is brought in as a kind of realistic photographic image. So entourage was everything that was not architecture. The mountains, the trees, the water, the sky, the landscape, the vegetation. It was everything that was on the other borderland that architecture was used to define, architecture being used as a kind of cultural construction to define that which is dividing between such problematic constructs as nature and culture. And this continues into modernism. We may not be drawing the same precedents or within the same aesthetic themes, but entourage becomes a fundamental part of modernism, now expanded to include everyday objects and airplanes and cars. And this will continue through architectural image making throughout the 20th century, with the biggest change primarily coming from initially Dada, the montage and the photo montage, the ways in which the objects as images from advertising and magazines and newspapers and everyday life could be exchanged into the high culture of painting and art and the cultural values that would be allowed to enter into the archive. This is the start of this idea of this exchange. It comes from Boris Groys, that innovation within art is a kind of exchange where cultural values are devalued in the profane realm, the realm that is outside of the cultural, becomes revalued as a kind of cultural goal in and of itself. We can think of here the exchange within collage and photo montage, but this goes through pop art, it goes into kitsch, it goes in with Duchamp without a doubt. And it's here within the use of the object beginning to have interrelationships or world built of objects themselves. Architecture takes on montage to deal with its entourage. It's one of the first ways in which architecture engages montages through entourage. Here we have Corbusier and Charlotte Perron, but of course this gets even more accelerated through the independent group and pop montage in the 1950s into the 1960s, where essentially what makes the house, what makes today's home so different, so appealing is precisely that there is no home. There's just the collection of commodities. that everything at a certain moment is an entourage that is building a world, that is building an idea of domesticity, and it is structured through the ways in which it is imaged and advertised and sold to us as the kind of cultural refuse of the everyday throwaway, disposable products of capitalism. Now that becomes incredibly important, as we know, and in a way turned and tuned into the speculative projects of the 1960s, where the world becomes a kind of ever-transforming mediation of images and mediation of entourage as objects. We don't need to go through all of these. The examples are very well known. But at a certain point, architecture gets pushed into the background and becomes the kind of stage set, the system that facilitates a world of entourage, world of exchange, world that could, in its operation, actually be built out of the ways in which one can sample and collect and bring together in new combinations that which has already been devalued by the cultures that have come before. So in a way, the entourage becomes critical. It creates a world, it creates a speculation on our world, through our world, in the ways in which it is recycled into new configurations that allow us to think differently about the scenarios of our inhabitation in the worlds that we can inhabit. It is part of how almost every architectural rendering is generated today is through a process of extraction and recontextualization. It is the ways in which architects are speculating on near futures, the ways in which we are building worlds through the images that we create. And importantly, I think what I'm trying to point out too is this question of familiarity, scenario, and audience. It always tends to hover towards a near future realism. This is not necessarily the fantasy escape, but the ways in which that which is around us already begins to combine and recombine into ever new formations. Now, there's another part to this, and this is the ways in which the objects themselves become the architecture. The architecture now, the cultural value of architecture devalued, and the former devalued product world becoming the environment itself. And if we think about the plans of Archizoom, especially the No Stop City project, in which architecture is reduced to a system of organization and mechanization and the provision of services, where everything else becomes these ephemeral objects that rotate, that shift, that fluctuate throughout the system. They are the furniture, they are the landscape, they are the products, they are the things that are movable. They are the things that are activating and producing the scenarios in which reality begins to become inhabited. And how furniture gets drawn is an aesthetic world in and of itself. Again, an aesthetic that is drawn against the stability of architecture, drawn to be informal, to be scattered, to be aformal in Rainer Banham's terms. And this sort of loose affiliation of juxtapositions and rejuxtapositions has become one of the most dominant plan strategies of contemporary architecture. Here we see Moss and the use of line weight to draw furniture and building as equal, but also the distribution of building and furniture as if they were informally recomposited and recombinable and rearrangeable, like a kind of entourage, like a kind of informality. And we don't have to go through all of them, but we have some of the biggest firms out there. We have Omei and Herzog Demeron and Sana and Ishigami and Big and Mancia and Tunon. It is not a locally contained phenomenon, that the building itself can be conceived of as a small piece of object-like entourage, reconfiguring and reconfigurable in a kind of local to local relationship within the environment. And I show this, we're at Cooper, and I show this not only because we're at Cooper, but it's a masterful drawing in and of itself. And just to remind us that Hayduk cut these objects out, positioned them, transfer rubbed them, and then traced them. These kinds of compositions are not things that one sits down and composes. They are part of the technology of reproduction. They are part of the world of montage. They are composed and recomposable through the ways in which one can extract and reposition and draw new relations between objects. Some more contemporary examples, Team for the Venice Biennale, extracting the cultural detritus of Detroit and rebuilding plants in Detroit from that extracted construction waste. Common Accounts assembling all the accoutrements and systems and objects and buildings and technologies and items that are necessary for one to be processed as dead in contemporary America, all of that being then pulled away from the buildings that it's usually housed in and revealed as a system in and of itself, objects transforming objects. Mark Gage taking found dolls from the internet and kit bashing them together to begin to become a new composition fused as a world of colluded and collided objects. Andrew Kovacs grabbing the detritus of the 99-cent store and stacking them and color coding them and bringing them together to become a world in and of itself, a kind of environment, a kind of ecology built out of everything that has been left alone by the popular and established culture of architecture, but is architecture nonetheless, especially in its new combinations. And then Ishigami, where plants themselves become the building, where the building is entourage now as plant objects, not plants in nature, plants which have been extracted to become figures which are repeatable, montageable, rotatable, combinable, but calling attention to the arbitrariness of the line that it is we are drawing between culture and nature, and architecture as a practice which is implicitly and explicitly part of that artificiality. And that is, at least in a gist, a kind of speculation on what the aesthetic recycling of cultural refuse could mean. So thank you. There's a really interesting thing that's going on right now with Joseph Littlejohn's camera. I don't know if you can see his camera, but he's got his screen on so that when I move one way, I move the other way at the same time. Because I know one of these is me. I'm not quite sure which one, but I'm pretty sure one of them.
Thank you so much for your presentations, Naomi, Hélène, and Michael. There's so much territory to cover, and I think I'm going to just start from the question in the chat and then move to my own questions, and probably Michael has a lot to say. So the question from Macarena de la Vega de Leon has to do with the structure of the book. So she mentions what were the initial themes that were anticipated and how these have been reorganized and changed in the kind of parts that you showed in the mosaic structure, Naomi, and also how much convincing or not did the publisher need to accommodate this shift? So it's an editorial question, I guess.
Well, yeah, it is an editorial question, although I guess it's, you know, it has bigger implications. And thank you for the question, Macarena. And I went back and looked because, to be honest with you, I couldn't remember. And I was fascinated to see that I think the structure we've ended up with is far more interesting than the one we originally conceptualized, which is maybe because, in truth, we thought it might be a kind of lost formwork, you know, that we might set it up in order to then knock it down. But our initial was a four-part structure, and it was much more about, it was much stronger on questions of disciplinarity. So there was a focus on writing landscape, writing architecture, writing place. Also on, let's say, academic fields. So one of the sections was about critical histories, another was about critical storytelling, another was about critical constructions, which we were calling writing experiments. And really overall, I think there was a kind of, there were several systems working at play, as you can hear, but one of the systems was like this kind of position on the scale between fiction and criticism. And I think ultimately what we ended up with was a much more organic, also more impressionistic, and let's say more art than science model in the ultimate order. And the happy news is that our editors and commissioning editor at Bloomsbury required no convincing whatsoever. They just went with what we felt was right for the book. I don't know whether you want to add to that, Hélène.
Yeah, just to say that, you know, to commence with, it was a helpful scaffolding, but pretty soon, you know, you have to pull the scaffold down. And I think the risk in kind of creating these rigid sections is that you overwrite in advance the content, or you try to kind of tame it, where in fact, in the end, I think we much more prefer the drift that one can journey, you know, take the journey through the book. Of course, probably no one reads a book from beginning to end these days. So even though we spent some time really kind of, you know, thinking through the sequence, people are going to pick it up and read it quite randomly in terms of its essays. But for us, that became then the driving logic, that there's a movement that cuts through. And I haven't seen the diagrams that Naomi put together for the presentation, and it's really great to see now that we can come back and reread again what the effect is that's been produced through the construction of the book as a whole. Yeah. I don't know where you can buy the book in New York.
I think, I mean, it is
online.
It has been
Online.
published. It is in the world. Yeah, but you buy it online through the Bloomsbury website. I think that's probably the quickest and easiest way right now.
I've put some information on that in the chat.
Yeah, you know, my initial reaction, I haven't seen a presentation in an architectural conversation without images in quite a while. And I think this was super interesting. It reminded me of how I'm trying to explain to my daughter why I read to her to go to sleep instead of showing her YouTube. So we had to exercise that kind of restraint in imagining different kinds of narratives and lines that could unfold in different directions while you were presenting the content. So I guess I have a couple of questions, and then we can go, and after that for Michael. The first question is about your presentation, whether it was meant to embody the content, whether it was meant to intentionally kind of hide through the absence of images, the kind of mobilization of the imagination toward these different lines of the representation being unfolded while you were speaking, which is something that you mentioned, Hélène, when you were speaking about writing as an experiment and not as a report, which I found very interesting. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that. And then I have a question about the kind of post-colonial context that you were referencing, especially because it is an incredibly important context in the current day where we have task forces in universities to think of how to decolonize our curriculums in architectural theory and pedagogy, and how to include alternative kinds of voices. So, you know, it's very possible that this kind of inclusion is also by different kinds of narratives and writing. So maybe you can address these two questions, and we can delve into a lot of very interesting questions that have come up in the chat after that.
If I talk about this question of lack of images, for instance, we might be able to answer Donald's question. Thanks, Donald, about architects being visual thinkers as well in the midst of it. For my opening, I just don't really think there was any need for images, in fact. And I think, you know, the art of listening is something that we've certainly underestimated and undervalued. I know that my own kids watch way too much kind of image-based media. But, you know, how do we listen to the stories? I mean, Naomi, I'm sure will have more to say about this because she's just worked recently on oral histories. But given also at the current moment that we're so plugged in constantly to our screens, I've become much more interested in how you close your eyes and listen instead, for instance. I think this question of architects being visual thinkers and producers, text profoundly, and storytelling has its own sort of image production inherently in it. You read a novel, you read a story, and images are produced in that process. And each person's image is going to be slightly different, for instance. So I think the two work very powerfully together. Maybe I'll pass over to Naomi though.
Yeah, I mean, this question comes up a lot, actually, interestingly enough, especially given that in this text and other texts that I've been involved with various types of experimental writing in architecture, the image sometimes becomes a kind of evidence, if you like, or a kind of moment where the somewhat speculative text is pinned back to reality, however you want to frame that. But interestingly enough, the thing that always comes up for me when we start talking about images and text is, yes, Helene's point about storytelling and the image that emerges in the mind through the telling of a good story, but also the ancient practice of ekphrasis or ekphrasis, which is, of course, about the very deliberate description of a thing which may or may not exist with the purpose of evoking a powerful and detailed image in the head of the listener. So this is a kind of like an ancient and highly honorific kind of practice. It's a form of rhetoric, part of the art of convincing, which is rhetoric. So, I mean, I find it a very interesting question because it is pretty radical in architecture to not show images, really. It's pretty radical because we're all used to sitting there and allowing our minds to wander as we explore the image and listen to what is being said, and to allow those things sometimes to, let's say, even conflict or to lead in different directions. And I'm sure we all very much enjoy that about architectural discourse. I certainly do. I mean, I love the image-rich character of architectural culture. But therefore, to not use an image is a radical thing to do. And therefore, Hélène and I and others do that quite deliberately.
And Michael did exactly the opposite, right?
Possiblemente. I mean, there's I think there's something important about what was also hinted at by Naomi of the deadpan and the hard-boiled writers, the highly detailed descriptive style of somebody like Raymond Chandler, who would write a specific scene, an episode, an event, a moment with as much precision and detail as possible so that it would begin to become real within the mind of the reader. And then once he had 20, 50 of these on a table, moving them around like this, a little bit like the cut up style that will eventually become burrows, until 2 of them, 3 of them next to each other began to do something strange, began to relate to each other in a alternate manner than they were just in their stable identity. And at that moment, they would become the sequence of the narrative. They would begin to become the story. They would become the difference between the hard-boiled black mask murder mystery and a typical straightforward murder mystery where you wanted to know who did the killing at the end of the story. And I think that's really important. And there's something very architectural about Chandler doing that. And I think there's something very important about that question within realism, which is about the hyper-specific detail overriding the conventions and hierarchies of genre that structure a narrative interpretation. And so it's different what I did. Yes, I showed things, but I think at a certain level, my allegiance has always been to realism.
I didn't mean that you showed to illustrate. So it's not that you showed to provide evidence of the things that you were saying, but it was actually very interesting when you showed that appropriation of the images by this company that didn't know that they took your image, and then it was, you used another image in the still life, and then that was used by another company. So the idea of, there's such a kind of cloud of a huge hoard of data, of images that in some point they become waste or refuse, as you argue. And I think that that became very clear in the way that you articulated this kind of recycling of the image itself becoming a kind of waste or piece of waste, which was very interesting. I want to, David Lieberman, I cannot possibly narrate your question. Maybe you want to, because it would take far too long. So if you want to address the speakers with your thoughts, that would be welcome.
Okay, thanks, Lydia. Perhaps, well, I thought I'd try, and then, typing it didn't seem to work, but let me try reading it, and maybe it's quickly, and it's a comment, but I hope it sort of prompts any of you to add more. Thank you, Helene, Naomi, Michael, and Lydia. My preference is to ask rambling questions. This is a first attempt at typing a query. In shifting from Anna Singh to Donna Haraway, I would suggest that the constantly shifting or multivalent concept of the Cthulhucene as described in Staying with the Trouble is more appropriate than the tripartite structure of the Anthropocene. Or a term I often use of fictive archaeologies of a yet to be written future histories, are foremost in what should be our speculative thoughts. In much of Michael's visuals, I find myself at a dinner party in Vienna, hosted by Daniel Sperry. In fact, there's a photograph of one of Daniel's tables that has been hanging over my desk for, I won't say how many years, since I was an art student. And a conversation of the Fluxus poets. Robert Feuillou and Emmett Williams are at the table. Should the examples of Dutch still lives include the skulls of the Vanitas paintings, which references the origins of Ficto-Criticism in Jeannie Randolph's psychoanalytical experience of spatial practice? Or it is in the most articulate spatiality of architectures, as Anne Carson reconsiders the empty spaces on the page in her rewriting of the fragments of Sappho, if not Winter. Or perhaps the musings of the last surrealist Julien Gracq in quoting Baudelaire, the shape of the city as we know it changes more quickly than the mortal heart.
I don't think this demands an answer. Simply, I think we can take it as like a wonderful response, in fact. I can say that I'm aware of an essay that sort of attempts to reclaim Jeannie Randolph as an important figure in ficto-criticism in the Canadian context. So she's definitely there. I don't know too much about her work, unfortunately, but she's part of that sort of legacy and history.
Was this where I admit to being a Western Canadian cowboy in my roots? No, I'm in Toronto this evening.
But certainly I'd agree with you that Thulacine that Donna Haraway constructs is a more compelling concept for us to imagine a future with, certainly.
Also, I mean, I think your formulation of, how have you said it, fictive archaeologies of yet to be written future histories is exactly it. That's precisely the, well, not for all of our authors, but for many of our authors, it's the possibility of dreaming new worlds into being, and which is, of course, one of the great contributions of architects, and I would say one of the great contributions that architects can make in our present catastrophic moment, that they can imagine other possible worlds, which is a practice. It's a projective practice, but it's also a practice of hope. So I think you framed it quite beautifully there.
Okay. Well, let me add one more thing, and it was interesting as you were the discussion of architectures only as text, which is why the Anne Carson thing is, I think, so important. But just as a moment of self-indulgence, a decade ago, I gave a keynote address at a film festival in Gorizia in Italy without a single visual. Now it was, there were sounds. It was all about architecture and sound and music. But it was wonderful to have this lecture hall filled with people waiting for the image to appear on the empty screen. And I would hope that their imaginations had the richness of some of the images that Michael showed us.
Wonderful. Thank you, David.
Thank
Mauricio,
you.
I think, Mauricio, do you want to, I think we have time for one more question, and Mauricio asks an excellent question about necessity. Maybe you want to address this on your own. Mauricio?
Do you want me to read it? Sure. Okay.
No, you can just ask it. It's a very clear.
Oh, okay. So yeah, your presentations made me think of Deleuze, and there's this short essay he wrote, "What is the Creative Act?" in which he articulates that creators make out of necessity, not for the fun of it. So a philosopher needs a concept, so he creates a concept, and so when we come to ficto-criticism, or architecture as adjective, or as assemblages of disciplines, genres, or entourages, etc., can you articulate the necessity driving the use of fiction as criticism, or criticism as fiction, or your chosen combination or flavor?
Well, I can't help but come back to the material on Deleuze, being a longtime Deleuze scholar. And in fact, I've directly written to this question of concept construction, drawing on Deleuze and Guattari, and also Isabel Stenges, in my recent book, Creative Ecologies, Theorizing the Practice of Architecture, where there's a large section dedicated to what I describe as concept tools. And as you say, and as Deleuze writes in that short essay, as elsewhere in collaboration with Guattari, it's not as though we choose a concept randomly in the abstract. It's rather an encounter, a very material encounter, perhaps an environmental encounter that provokes us to, act in some way, to generate a concept that then we can apply in order to make our way through a situation. So there's a very kind of powerful sort of call on us to construct concepts that are appropriate to the situations we find ourselves in, almost as an ethical act in a way. And this might also be a way of bringing us back through the questions of ficto-criticism and its historical association with acts of decolonization, that it's part and parcel of that discursive practical sort of works of engaging with minority figures and so forth. And ficto-criticism, critical fictions, ficto-criticism without a hyphen, with a hyphen, the ficto-critic, I think it kind of doesn't matter. We make a point in the introduction with or without the hyphen, maybe it produces different effects. Perhaps you use it with or without, depending on the effect you want to produce based on the particular problem you want to deal with in that moment. I think for me, again, why I drew attention to the environmental humanities is because there's a sense in which the humanities, and we can think here also of the architectural humanities, finds that it needs to address itself to the urgent problems of the day, to our contemporary emergencies, which in addressing these situations demand the deployment of concepts that are either ready prepared or have to be adapted for the situation, or newly invented concepts. So I would hope that within ficto-criticism, it wasn't a sort of merely aesthetic exploration, that there was always some situated problem that we were coping with, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, and indeed, another way of saying that, or perhaps as an extension, would be to say that ficto-criticism is indeed a politicized and a political act. And for that reason, I would say that it's absolutely necessary for those of us who believe that scholarly conventions, genre conventions, the kind of grey eminence of architecture and its history must be and should be questioned and challenged and rethought, both for decolonizing purposes, but also to include voices which have not and otherwise will not ever be heard, which must be heard. That's the political call. It's definitely political. Therefore, I would say it's an absolute necessity.
I think that's a perfect ending for our conversation. It is a necessity, not just to include and find these voices, but to allow alternative mediums of representation and expression to unfold. So I want to thank you immensely for for showing those alternative mediums of representation to us, to both Naomi and Hélène, and to Michael Young for sharing all the wonderful insights on cultural refuse. Thank you also to the audience for asking all of these questions. So good night. Thank you very much for being with us today, and we hope to meet in person. And we already are living in a better world a little bit since Saturday, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Congratulations to all three.